Yeah, all good.
Welcome to this weird online world. And welcome to all the people participating in this webinar. Um, this is the fourth in the series, Lights Up On, where we interview theatre makers from right across the profession, find out about what it is that they do, how they ended up in the positions that they're in. And it's aimed at students of drama and theatre and anyone who's interested in entering the theatre profession, anyone who's currently working in the theatre profession, and also just curious audience members. This morning I'm talking to Tarek Merchant. Hello,
Yeah.
Tarek.
Hey there, how you doing?
Our previous sessions have been with Kate Cross from The Egg, Nikki Miles Weldon from Grey Eye Theatre, Gemma Brooks, a freelance production manager, and all of those webinars are available for you to watch on the Roustabout Theatre YouTube channel. Anyone who's participating in this currently live, later on there'll be the opportunity for you to ask questions. And if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a box that says Q&A. And if you type your questions into that box, then we will attempt to answer as many of them as possible. Thank you very much. So, Tarek, hello. It's really nice to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you too. Thanks for this opportunity.
That's great. So I suppose my first question to you would be, what do you do? We've advertised you as a performer, a musical director, and a composer. So it's quite a lot of hats.
Yeah.
What do each of those jobs entail?
Well, yeah, no, good question. Okay, yeah. So I as you say, I suppose I do a little bit of or have done a little bit of all of those things, and perhaps sort of other roles as well. So as a performer, that's right. So sometimes as an actor, as a straight actor, sometimes as an actor musician, so an actor who plays musical instruments in a production. Sometimes as a musical, well, a lot of the time as a musical director, which would be taking on the role of having to maybe work with the cast to realize the musical content for production, coach the cast to say sing the score, or work with the band and rehearse the band to and then bring those components together. Sometimes that can entail continuing to play with the production in performance and actually conduct the show live in front of an audience every night, trying to hold the different runaway parts of the cast and the band together. Sometimes it might be mounting all that and then sort of sending it on its way, and kind of in a slightly more musical supervisor type role, maybe, where you're helping oversee the musical content of the production, but you're not actually involved in the delivery of it on a night-to-night basis. So often playing piano for shows in that capacity as an MD. So yeah, playing the piano live as part of the show. I also compose, as you mentioned. So in that context, my responsibility would be to actually make the material, the musical material for the show, the songs or the underscore or everything else that might be used in the show, which again might sometimes be done in conjunction with then having a responsibility to help deliver it in some way, but sometimes not. And in addition to that, I also do arranging and orchestrating work, transcription work for other composers who might send me demos and want piano vocal scores made of their work. And I also do teaching and coaching. I have done in drama schools, both in terms of coaching students with singing and acting through song, but also overseeing helping students who want to do more orchestration and arranging work for actor musician shows and coaching them, and really everything in between. Like I'm available, here's my business card. So yeah, anything, auditions accompanying, repetiteur work for rehearsals, basically yeah, gun for hire, musical, music and theatre combo. So all of those things.
You'll get a sense, those of you who aren't currently working in theatre, quite how many roles artists, performing artists take on in order sometimes just simply to pay the rent. And it's there's this phrase that your careers teachers at some point, if they careers teachers still exist, I don't know, would say to you is the portfolio career. And I think anyone who works in the performing arts will, if not currently have a whole set of different roles, will be taking on all sorts of opportunities. And that's actually, I always find, adds to the richness of the work, and what you learn from students actually has a very direct impact on what you do professionally, when you work with amateur companies, that has an impact on your professional work, and vice versa.
I completely agree with all of that for sure.
Do you ever get confused with all the different hats that that you wear?
Sort of accidentally find myself like trying to be Hamlet in a production where I'm meant to be behind the piano, like just no, I think one thing I think I might be quite good at, but remains to be seen. Other people watching this who know me might disagree. Is I think I'm quite good at modulating my involvement in a creative team or a company in terms of if I know that, for example, the musical buck stops with me. Then I'm quite happy with that. But if I understand that I sit in maybe in a bigger production, a more commercial production, there might be many more layers to the sort of creative team chain. There might be a composer and a musical supervisor who I'm working under as a musical director to sort of deliver the show each night. And I hope that I am quite good at modulating how I work with people so that I can do what's needed for each individual show. So yeah, hopefully I don't get too carried away going, you know, the music should go like this when actually I didn't compose it that time or something like that. But yeah, hopefully not.
And I think one of the things that's beginning to emerge through the course of these webinars is that theatre is quite structured, and that people have very definite roles. And although those roles might be flexible, and in some situations some of those roles are missing, actually there's quite a hierarchy, not in terms necessarily of power, but in terms of decision making and buck stopping,
Yeah.
as it were, that happens in a piece of theatre. And those, you know, if you've worked in school productions or fringe productions or amateur productions, those roles are much more fluid than they are in professional theatre.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, no, I think you're dead right. I think knowing what for each individual project professionally where you are in that structure is probably quite an important point in terms of knowing what your remit is, what kind of voice you have in the rehearsal room, yeah, and what really falls on you, and what you it's okay for you to be a conduit or a sort of you know, liaison for. Yeah.
How did you end up doing what you do today? I mean, give us your life in art.
Okay. Brace yourself. Okay, no. Well, I always wanted to be an actor, so that was I even when I was a kid, I remember that I had I used to watch West Side Story on endless repeat, and I have a little tie that I used to wear that was my like Russ Tamblyn tie that was, and I would like do a kind of Russ Tamblyn death on the sofa. So I think at that point I kind of I thought, oh, I want to be a performer and I want to be an actor. And but I was always still even as a student when I was younger, I would be you know, I did all my music. My parents were really brilliantly supportive in terms of helping us learn. I studied piano, and then I studied some violin and some flute as well when I was still at school. And then, so I was still doing like bits of, I would find that I was writing my own songs and stuff like that, but I still, my head space was like, I'm going to be an actor. That's the thing I'm going to do. And then my parents suggested that as parents so often do, maybe I understand that it might be wise to get a qualification that one could fall back on, that it was maybe a little bit much to put all one's eggs in the acting basket. So I actually went to York University and did a music degree there. And I don't know if music was quite what they intended as my fallback. I think maybe they would have quite liked me to have done something slightly further away from the performance stuff. So I was maybe, my second basket of eggs was quite close to my first basket of eggs, maybe. But so I did 3 years at York University studying music, and I think maybe secretly at the end of it they maybe hoped that I wouldn't still say I still want to go to drama school, but I did still want to go to drama school. So as I was graduating from York, I applied to a handful of drama schools, and I didn't get in the first year. And so I took a year out at that point, and I decided I wanted to do as much learning as I possibly could to try and get sort of more match fit. I felt like I'd spent the 3 years studying music. I was maybe a little bit out of shape as a performer. So I sort of trawled the internet for all of the drama school Saturday classes, evening courses, and I did a whole host, I think, you know, as many as I could afford. I was working the rest of the time to try and fund it. working in a library, trying to raise the money to keep doing all these, you know, any workshops that were being presented by individual theatre companies. And I remember getting a load of books that I knew were on reading lists for drama school and reading through them ahead of time and trying to just do as much as I could myself. And then applied again the next year for drama school. And I think I felt like I had to slightly play down the music at this point. It was becoming it was interesting. I felt like it was quite often a little bit of a stumbling block actually in the interviews for drama school, that they'd sort of be a bit like, so what do you want to do? You seem a bit sort of like you're a bit unfocused, or maybe in terms of what your definition is as a performing arts sort of individual. And so it got to the point where I started taking the music and my music degree and my interest in music slightly off my applications for drama schools. But at I think it was at the recall for Guildhall, I didn't get in there, but one of the tutors said, have you heard of the actor musician course at Rose Bruford College? And I hadn't done. And so that sort of refocused me a little bit, and I did a bit more research into it and found that there was a course that was an actor training for actors who play musical instruments. And that suddenly felt like, oh, maybe this is actually, rather than me having to pretend that I haven't got the musical component as part of my interest, I could actually capitalize on it. So I applied for Rose Bruford and was delighted to get accepted for the 3-year actor musician undergraduate course there. So I did that for 3 years. Is this too long? Is this too long an answer? Is this too long-winded?
No. This is,
sure. You can have like an air horn. You can have like an air horn to stop me if it gets too long. Yeah, that's right. Then I was very lucky in that at the end of the 3 years at Rose Bruford, where again I was very much still training to be an actor musician, and it was very much a performance path. An absolutely brilliant musical director and orchestrator called Sarah Travis, who does done a lot of actor musician work, is absolutely fantastic, came in and worked with us on a production of Into the Woods and needed some students to help. She couldn't take on the full responsibility of scoring the whole show and ending the whole show, so they sort of paired some students that she could sort of mentor, and I was one of the students that got to work under Sarah and learnt so much from her. And then she actually offered me my first professional job as I was graduating, and she was working on a production of Sunset Boulevard as an actor musician show at the Watermill Theatre, which many of us know quite well. So that was my very first professional job, and it was as her show MD. So I was I did have a tiny performance role in it, and I was sort of visible as part and on stage as part of the actor musician performance. But really my responsibility was to kind of conduct and play the show from the keys every night. And I think suddenly everything just sort of weirdly clicked into place. I hadn't quite worked out how all these different component parts that I'd been interested in, the music, the acting, the fact that I'd always been writing my own stuff, I hadn't quite worked out that there might be one, or a way is, I guess it's not one, but several ways in which those things could join together. And really after that show, I sort of just felt like a square peg in a square hole, I suppose, in that I could after that, I was very lucky to get some other performance opportunities. I say often as an actor, but then increasingly as a musical director, maybe a musical director, but undermining any authority by dressing as a fox or something like that. But really, just that, and then off the back of that, I was then doing more orchestrating and arranging, and then latterly in the last sort of 4 or 5 years have had more chances to compose scores for Christmas shows and family shows, and write more music, be more of a composer, and really, yeah, that's sort of how it all happened. So now I feel like I'm that was 12 years ago I graduated from Rose Bruford, and since then I sort of feel like I've just sort of exploring all the different avenues that music and theatre work in the professional industry.
Right. There's 2 things I'd like to pick up on that, and one which is you used the word lucky. So you were lucky enough that Sarah Travis came to teach you, and I think as we go through these webinars, we'll hear that word more and more frequently. And I was lucky enough to meet. I got luck. This is obviously something you can't manufacture, luck, and maybe it's something that we could reflect on in another session. But like whether there is such a thing as luck, or whether it's the ability to spot an opportunity when it comes along, or but so many people's career paths have these moments where they feel lucky enough to have met. I mean, I have a number in my own career. Lucky enough to have met the right person at the right time, and to recognise that as an opportunity and be able to kind of jump on that. The other thing that I found very interesting was when you mentioned auditioning at Guildhall and then saying, "Have you heard of the actor musician course at Rose Bruford?" You presumably hadn't, because actor musicianship is actually a fairly new idea, isn't it? It's a fairly new way of working in theatre. I just wondered if you.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Did they exist when we were younger? Actor musicians.
Well, I understand now that I think it has in various ways been around for quite a bit, but I just wasn't sort of aware of it in the same way, I think. So I understand now that in various ways the work of John Doyle and the work of Bob Carlton, and there have been examples of directors who have been exploring it, I think, for quite a couple of decades, I think. But I think at the time that I did see that very famous production there was a very famous production of Sweeney Todd done as an actor musician show that came into the West End and then went to Broadway, which actually Sarah, the MD that I mentioned, was the supervisor and orchestrator for. And that was really my first taste at going, oh, there's this world where you can do both those things. But I only found that out, I only saw that production maybe, I think it was in my year out, between university and drama school. And so, yes, you're right, by the time I certainly wasn't aware that there were designated courses that could train you in that way. And now there are actually, at that point, that was the only course. Now, both Mount View and Guildford School of Acting, at least there might even be another, I think, but they also run pathways that are to do with training actors who play musical instruments. So it's, in a way, I think it is more visible, it is more present, but I think the work might have been running for a while, but I didn't find it until that point.
And one of the things that noticeable more successful shows that use actor musicians is the incorporation of the musical instruments into the performance. I know Sarah's very, very good at this. In that production of Sunset Boulevard, for instance, how were the instruments incorporated into the performance? Because some people won't quite know what we're talking about.
No, sure thing. So yeah, in actual fact, so in those kind of productions, like Sunset Boulevard, you're absolutely right that what was taken was the entire score as it might have been orchestrated for a pit band for a musical like you'd go and see in any kind of conventional setting, and then reworked so that the very actors who are playing the roles that you're seeing, Norma Desmond, Max the butler, Sheldon, I think his name is, the sort of studio Hollywood executive, all of these people are actually simultaneously playing instruments that are sort of aesthetically woven into the visuals of the production, so that you're simultaneously getting the full score delivered live to you, but also seeing that made visually on stage. And I think when it's done well, as you say, can be done very cleverly, so you're actually getting new angles in on character and story by virtue of seeing the instrumentation being played live for you. So like one example, I think there was one of the actors who played one of the studio executives, who was very quick talking, and the text they had was very sort of pattery, studio Hollywood schmaltz, like business talk, would be simultaneously playing a walking bass line on the double bass while they were delivering this text. And you sort of get you're sort of reading that moment both ways, that actually there's a little motor running underneath that text, and that's exactly the same motor that's in the dialogue that he's delivering. And so actually in that moment of seeing the studio executive sort of maybe even absent-mindedly or distractedly, like it's hard to get his attention, playing the double bass and picking out this pizzicato walking bass line, you actually reading something about the scene at the same time. And I think there were other moments like that, like Max the butler at one point when everything was going wrong and Norma Desmond's, it's all falling apart and he knows how distraught she's going to be. He had some epic cymbal rolls, and you sort of read in that moment his passion and anxiety for Norma so it's sort of and in the production of Sweeney Todd I saw they did it very cleverly with Anthony and Joanna, the two lovers, both playing cellos, and you would read in the playing of these rather romantic sonorous cello lines, you would actually read some of their relationship through that. So yeah, it's sort of it's a strange thing where you're sort of being asked as an audience to see both things at the same time. You're seeing the architecture of the music played live, but you're also seeing the full performance exactly with all of the characters and all of the characterization and staging and delivery that you would see if you were seeing a non-acting musician show, in a way. And you hopefully get two lenses to read the story that way, even if some of it's a bit subconscious or not necessarily completely logical. But yeah.
And there's always this challenge with acting musicians of justifying why that character suddenly has an instrument on stage. Was it Calamity Jane at the Watermill? Or
yeah, they did. That's right. Yeah,
they were using their guitars and flutes as rifles.
right. Yeah.
So the instrument actually became a prop, which was then through the magic of theatre transformed into something else. So you've got this wonderful holistic, like, you know, picture on stage,
Yeah.
of acting performance, music performance, and the instrument itself acting metaphorically as something else.
Yeah, totally. I think I heard that about, they maybe did a Guys and Dolls as well, where I think maybe all the gangsters sort of came out with like music cases, but then actually take out their musical instruments or something like that. So you know, yeah, exactly as you say, sort of playing on the reality or lack of it as to how those instruments could be there.
I've got a feeling that this is actually a growth area in theatre at the moment, and there's a real interest in the incorporation of music onto stage and us seeing the performance of music by characters. So I imagine that's a career path that some people would be quite interested in pursuing. If we had anyone watching who was interested in acting musicianship, or indeed being an MD or a composer, what sort of skills or trainings or experience would be useful for them to be collecting at the moment?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, slightly boringly, I would say a facility on your main instrument. I think one thing can be, in the acting musician world, there is a use for this, which is that quite often you could be asked to be a jack of all trades. So you're sort of picking up lots of different instruments or doing as needed to deliver the music for a show. And there is absolutely a place for that, and I certainly don't disparage that. But personally, I think being really, really good at one instrument is actually a more useful starting point for getting involved in productions or being likely to be cast in productions. So if anyone watching is studying an instrument, I would say the key thing I would say is keep applying yourself to it. I know from personal experience how boring it can be when you're sometimes being nagged by parents or teachers to keep up your instrumental study and practice. And it's funny, I think back and I remember finding it really arduous for when I was growing up, the idea that, I have to do an hour on my piano and an hour on violin or whatever. And somewhere that changed, and I don't know quite where, but somewhere I turned to loving playing, and so I would say persevere through even the difficult sort of patches where you're not sure you're making as much progress as fast as you'd like. So really, really being good. If you're a pianist, I would say, when I was at university, there were some other excellent pianists in my year, and better pianists than I was, and they would always get the big platformed opportunities to do big showy piano concertos. They were always the ones who got those opportunities, and I was always the one who ended up accompanying opera singers at York. And I remember at the time being really disappointed, like, why am I always getting these accompaniment opportunities? I never get to be the center of attention playing the piano and actually, in hindsight, I think the fact that I did so much accompanying, that I learned to play with other players, that I learned to play with singers and accompany singers, has been like incredibly useful. So if you're a pianist, I would say try and, after we're out of social distancing, I would encourage doing accompanying singers. I think playing with other people is really, really valuable and really important. I think sight reading skills are really, really important and really valuable, and you're never going to regret trying to get good at having a piece of music put in front of you and trying to unpick what that might be without having had a lot of prior time on it. That's always when I do auditions accompanying for drama schools and things like that. That's a skill that is often called upon, and that's been needed in rehearsals as well, where suddenly a composer will rewrite a song at no notice and put it in front of you and ask you to teach it to the cast 10 minutes after they've jotted it down, and you have to be in a position to do that. So sight reading, I'd say, is good. But other than that, I reckon it's such a cliche, but I do genuinely think listening and watching the widest variety of things. I think one other thing I'm aware of is that in theatre, people, this makes me sound like I've got no personality or identity, but people always ask me, what kind of music do you do for theatre? And I think the truth is every production has really genuinely needed a completely different musical personality in a way, and that you'll suddenly find you have to get really interested in Balkan gypsy music for a project, and then you have to get really interested in medieval polyphony for another project, and you have to get really interested in Sinatra's output for another project. And I think like actually just being really open and versatile to those different styles. So I would say just listen really widely, listen to anything and everything that people recommend to you. And the same with watching things. I think, at the moment there are there's obviously a range of fantastic theatre productions being streamed. I know it's no substitute for being there live, but it's a great free way of getting exposure to lots of other pieces of theatre and hearing how the music's used in those. So I reckon good instrumental skills. This is my like bullet point. Good instrumental skills, bit of sight reading. Oh no, I've got one last thing, which would be I don't know if this counts, but I think being being personable. I don't know if that counts. I don't know if that's so. I think so. I think we could all be doing work, me included, on being being a person that people want to work with in a room, and people want to pick the brains of, and people want to collaborate with. So anything you do, so that's a good excuse to be nice and sociable, or all those other things. At the moment we could just be learning how to be nice people to be around. So
probably make the world a better place as well.
Yeah, true.
We've got a question that one of our participants has given, which actually ties into this. From the shows that I've seen with actor musicians, I've seen a lot of accordions, I've seen a lot of ukuleles and guitars, I've seen a couple of violins. Is there are there some instruments which naturally lend themselves to actor musicianship, which work better on stage?
Right, yeah.
It used to be ukuleles, it's now accordions. What's the next accordion,
Well, yeah, no, I suppose the accordion's brilliant because ordinarily, so many scores might use a piano as a backbone, but obviously a piano is so static. So actually in an actor musician show, it can be incredibly helpful to have the piano, but it can also be slightly limiting because whoever's there, it's hard to feature them in the action or be playing on the ways in which actor musicianship can be used, because they have to be sat behind a piano, and maybe that's slightly limiting, although I have seen shows where that's been used quite effectively. So the accordion is sort of like going, here's our mobile piano. So I think that's why that's been so favored, is because it gives you such a full accompaniment sound like a piano might, but in a mobile way. I think string players are always massively valuable in actor musician shows. And I think one of the reasons I hate to say it is because they're often asked to do two things at the same time. Well, multiple, but whereas a flautist or a trumpeter could literally, if they're playing a line, they can only play the line. They can move, but they can play a trumpet line. A violinist could move, play a violin line, and be singing something completely different on top of the violin line. So, and the same for a cellist or a bass player. So instruments that don't use mouths, I think they're always very useful, because you sort of get like more for your buck, I suppose, out of those performers, because you can be literally asking them to do 3 or 4 things at the same time. Having said that, I think all instruments are potentially incredibly useful, and again, it slightly depends on the piece. I did an actor musician production of Fiddler on the Roof not long ago, and that had really quite a wide spread of instruments, because it needed to have that kind of klezmer Jewish feel, but also feel full and sort of fairly symphonic at times as well, and you do all of those things. So I think to be honest, a bit of all of those instruments for different shows I think are very valuable. But I think I suppose more mobile, double bass is another risky one, because it can often be rather static or take up a lot of space on a stage. But I know bass players who've been asked to put a wheel on the end of their double bass and wheel it around the stage, or cellists who are asked to wear straps that they can carry the cello so that they can be mobile and not need to put the cello spike down and be in a fixed position. So really anything if it's mobile, I think that's probably my tip. Mobility. So if you're playing or studying a more static instrument, maybe explore what the realms of movement might be with that. So yeah.
And if in doubt, there are those extraordinary buskers in Covent Garden, aren't there, who have cellos around their necks
Yeah,
and,
totally.
and all sorts of ways of carrying their instruments.
Completely.
I've got a very specific question here,
Yeah.
which I'm going to read. It comes in a number of bits, so listen
Sure thing.
It says, "Hi Tarek, I'm Vikas Rawat, theatre actor composer from Mumbai, India.
Oh, brilliant.
I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I've been in situations where the director wants music that's almost plagiarized. Create something exactly like this. Or the director is taking you into a direction where your music stops sounding like yours and sounds terrible. More beats, more trumpets, but you've got to do it for the money. Have these things happen to you, and how do you tackle such situations?"
Oh, that's a really good question. That's an excellent question. Well, you're right. I think the problem with, you're right, different directors will have different vocabularies with which to communicate to you their intentions. So I think the tricky thing can be that sometimes saying, "Oh, I want it to sound exactly like this," is a short, or can be a shorthand for not quite knowing how else to explain to someone what they want out of something. So saying, "Oh, I found a piece of music that does it," kind of, "I basically want this." I think it can be used as a slight kind of catch-all, because there isn't maybe the vocabulary to say, "Oh, I'd like it to be syncopated and to have sound of tremolo strings underneath," or whatever the description would be. And so I think I totally hear your pain. I think maybe trying to identify what it is in the piece of existing music that is particularly appealing to the director's taste or dramatic vision for that, and then that might give a clearer way as to what characteristics in it you need to retain or try and capitalize on, without necessarily having to replicate the entire piece as it stands. I think there's a much bigger question, which you totally hit on completely fairly, about one's voice as a composer in theatre, which, if I'm honest, I think it can be quite hard to express your own voice as a composer in theatre, in that your music will always be in service of something, and that it can be frustrating if actually what is needed is something that, as you say, is very much a pastiche of an existing piece or an existing style. It can be that actually frustratingly that the best way of delivering that music is to do something that they can't tell that it's you, that actually it does sound like an original existing piece or something like that, that it's not necessarily your voice. That can be a frustrating situation. So I think maybe it doesn't quite answer your question. I'm sorry. The answer is it's a problem, but but maybe continuing to find avenues and windows outside of that context where you could be exploring and expressing your own voice musically, and then sort of maybe accepting that there will be compromises on that, or limitations on how much one expresses oneself, when you might be expressing, when really perhaps the primary need might be to express a place or time, or a sensation, a drama, an emotion, an atmosphere. There might be other things that unfortunately in that moment have to be given ultimate priority. I was reading Michael Bruce's book about writing music for the stage, and I think he often says in it, that actually sometimes the best music is the one that no one recognizes, or no one notices. It's just it's sometimes it can be that, not always, but that actually having something under a bit of text, but that doesn't pull your ear so that you're not listening to the dialogue anymore, is actually the best offer that one could do there. So yeah, I hear you. I would say that was a long-winded but hopefully encouraging answer.
I've got a potentially controversial question here.
Okay. So I brace myself.
So Victoria asks, because acting musicians are generally more economically viable for theatre productions, do you think musicians are losing out?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think there has definitely been concern about that in the past. I have heard that, and I know that actually in the States, when that Sweeney Todd went over to Broadway, I think I actually had some friends who were musicians in New York, and I know that they had concerns about whether, if the actor musician trend really took off, that actually it would be a cheaper way for producers to be supplying music for shows that would take work away from musicians and pit bands. So it's a totally valid question. I think that in defense of actor musicianship, I would say that it can be used and I think it was born from an economic requirement, but I guess used really well or used sophisticatedly and cleverly can be so much more than that now. So that's my defense of actor musicianship. I think in terms of whether it takes work away for other musicians, I think the truth is, in those specific shows, yes, potentially does. But I think in the broader theatre landscape, there will always be pit bands. Like there are shows that it's not appropriate for actor musicians to play, and there are shows where it wouldn't be possible to get the sound that you need for the show with actor musicians. It wouldn't be appropriate. There will always be shows where it's necessary to have a pit band playing. So and I just worked on Girl from the North Country in the West End over Christmas, and that had live on stage band, and the musicians were slightly staged around the action and interwoven with the action, but they were musicians who were on musician contracts, who were playing as a band but integrated. So I think depending on where the slider lies, if those musicians were absolutely brilliant, but they probably wouldn't have liked to have been given a monologue to do. So actually, depending on where the slider sits for that individual production, I think will determine where the skill set for the musicians needs to be placed. Last thing might be worth saying is that I think also Equity has worked quite hard in recent years to make sure that actor musicians themselves are being recompensed in an appropriate way, I think, which has slightly redressed the feeling, I think, that you can just get absolutely everything you want out of an actor musician for cheap. So that's probably slightly reset the balance a little bit, so that producers are more inclined to turn. I think it means that the choice as to whether to use actor musicians or musicians in a band will be less economically driven now than it might have been in the past. Although, if I dare mention the C word, COVID, I do worry or wonder what that will look like the other side of this, whether in fact there might be a resurgence in the use of actor musicians in that way, because it's going to be potentially more economic for some theatres, but also I wonder if the spatial opportunities that presents might be easier to manage than having, I know sort of pit bands is one of the other areas of ongoing concern and consideration at the moment. So yeah, my answers are so long-winded, and I'm not even sure if they answer the question.
Very detailed. I'd not even thought about the pit band problem, and I keep solving the problem of post-COVID theatre, and then forgetting that actors have to be closer than 2 meters to each other. Yeah. And I hadn't even gone as far as the pit band. I mean, that's a whole other world of pain, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tom has asked, in actor musician shows, how are the instruments assigned to the parts? Is this down to the role of a composer, or the MD, or a musically minded director, or is it a collaboration from all creatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say probably the last of those options, that it's absolutely a combination of all those things. So the musical supervisor or arranger will normally take the original scores, and having worked out perhaps ahead of time what kind of lineup they might need for a show. So if it's going to be Guys and Dolls, you're going to need some good brass section. That's going to be a necessary thing. If you're doing The Light in the Piazza, you're going to need some strings and delicate sort of romantic string sounds and woodwind and things. If you're doing there's going to be a demand on what you need from the score based on the style of the score and the existing scoring, then they'll do a version of what they think is a suitable reduction. Say if you've got a cast of 10 or 11, they'll take what could often be quite a big scoring and reduce it to make sure all of the pertinent information is still retained across 11 actor musicians, or however many it turns out to be. And then that's really just a starting point, because then once you get in the rehearsal room, invariably almost at every turn there'll be, oh well, that person can't play that trumpet line because they're having a changed costume, and we need that table moved from there to there, so that person's going to have to switch onto the piano so that person can come off the piano and go and move that table. And then the composer, the orchestrator, MD or supervisor will always be keeping on top of that and sort of having to make ongoing switches and changes based on the physical demands of the staging. So and directors similarly will be making hopefully inspired choices by the music. So they'll go, oh, how brilliant that character is playing that really exposed flute line there. Great. Well, let's really feature them in the middle of this scene and we can make something out of that. But they might go, that's going to be really distracting and I can't have that flute line there. Please put that on something else. So it's really the allocation of the music and that will also come down to the performers as well, that they might say, I can really do this. I can speak those lines and do that dance and play a bass line on a wheeling around bass. I can do that. Or they might go, what are you talking about? I definitely can't do that. Please don't ask me to do that. We open in 2 days. And I think so it's absolutely that dialogue between all of those components. So very much the orchestrator, MD or supervisor, depending on the structure of the creative team, will come to the rehearsals with a document or a template of what they imagine might be a good starting point. But that's really just a jumping off point, and then everything that happens in terms of the staging and rehearsals after that will have an impact on what ends up being the finished allocation of music for the performance.
Okay, that's fascinating. I've not ever worked other than as a writer on a actor-musician show, and just to hear quite how the rehearsal room dynamics inform the final production, as in any rehearsal, I guess.
Yeah.
So many things you're holding simultaneously, aren't you? I've got a question here. It says, well, first of all, they say thank you for doing the Q&A.
Oh, no worries.
How essential is an academic background in music or composition to become a composer, musical director in theatre? Should anyone who wants to go into this line of work pursue a bachelor, master's degree in music? That's
an that's a really interesting question. Ultimately, I think not. Okay, this is really tricky. This is quite dangerous, and this is just my take. So I'm not saying that this is definitive. My feeling is that that in this context, the fact that I studied music and I did a degree in music has obviously meant that I've spent a lot of time playing music and looking at music and listening to music and learning about music. And so in that sense, it's enriched my ability to work as a composer or a musician or a performer. But no one required, in a performance capacity, unlike a number of other jobs, no one is turning to me saying, oh, would you like to write this because you have a music degree? Or oh, we were going to ask you to write this piece, but then we saw you didn't have a music degree, so unfortunately we've asked a different composer. You know, like that it doesn't feel like it's not a requirement of being given the trust to do that work. If you wrote a piece of music and someone heard that music and said, that's exactly the kind of music I'd like for my show, and you'd put that online, it could be that that's your way into a director getting in touch and saying, I'd really like you to write the music for this show that I'm doing. So I think, having said that, I suppose it's given me a confidence about the fact that I've studied it, that I know I know the nuts and bolts of it, and that gives me a confidence and an integrity, I hope, to the way that I work. I have a feeling that, again, it'd be interesting to see what it's like the other side of this hiatus, but often it's about finding a way into the industry as well. How does one, and I suppose for me, having studied music, and then that music might have helped me get into Rose Bruford in some way, and then Rose Bruford helped me get to MD my first, or show MD my first show, and that got me into that world of MDing and composing. So in that sense, it's been part of the stepping stone to get there, but there are obviously a huge number of other routes that could have got there too. So so I'm afraid I don't have a definitive answer. I think I would say I really wanted to study music as well. When I made that choice that that's what I was going to do, I thought, this is something I can apply myself to for 3 years and really enjoy getting up each day to study and learn about. And that was important too. So I think if your passion is to compose and do that, then I think getting that course of study and doing that would be a lovely thing, and would be very inspiring and really help build the nuts and bolts that one might use. But I don't think it's the only path, and I don't think that the way the arts work requires academic qualifications to open up the doors in the way that I think other industries might work. So yeah, that's my kind of slightly sitting on the fence answer.
No, and I would not only echo what Tarek just said there, but I would also add to that, something I say to a lot of young people that I meet, is find out what sort of learner you are. I learn very well by reading and by talking to people and by listening to. So my education has been like very traditionally academic, and that's the route that led me to where I am now. However, I've taught many people who would hate to spend 3 years reading, which as I did doing my English degree, and actually 3 years doing is important to them. I've also met many people who work in theatre that the idea of going and doing any more studying at all was complete anathema to them. So the moment they left school, they formed a theatre company and have worked their way. And actually, if you know how you learn best, you know, if you get a really strong sense of how am I going to acquire the skills and experience and knowledge that I need, then that will point you towards the right sort of career path.
That's such a
and it's different for everybody. I would have got, I teach at Bristol Old Vic Theatre School. I personally would have got very bored at Bristol Old Vic Theatre School because it's a vocational non-academic course, and I like to read books. That said, it's a fantastic training for people who like to do things. Similarly, I've worked with many people from Wardrobe Ensemble, many of whom came out of an extension of Bristol Old Vic Young Company called Made in Bristol, and they've just done it. With no training whatsoever. They've just done the thing. So find out what sort of person you are.
I think that's a brilliant answer, because also the other thing I forgot to say, of course, is that in the same way, I chose to go to university to do music, but many other musicians would be going to music college, where the relationship of academic sort of written work versus performance-based work would be quite different. So absolutely, and as you say, like you, Toby, I think I quite enjoyed doing my research and essays and stuff like that at school, and so that was an okay thing for me to think of as a component of my music degree, whereas I think I would know of other musicians who were just like, absolutely that, I want to play music and make music, I don't want to be writing about Bach, whatever it is, you know, so motets or something. So yeah, I totally echo what you're saying there. For finding out what kind of learner you are is a great tip.
Yeah, I've just got a couple more questions, then I'll ask my the question that we always ask our guests. I'm just finding out about actor-musician shows. How are they different from musical theatre? And I know we've talked about seeing the instruments on stage.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you could?
Well, I think the demands on the performer are slightly different. Therefore, so you'll still be required to be a really good vocalist. Ideally, that would be great. So singing and working on your singing is always going to be a valuable component, as is acting and being all of the acting components of it. In terms of movement and dance, I suppose on a musical theatre performer, the demands might be slightly greater still than on a actor-musician performer, where by virtue of the fact that they are playing an instrument at the same time, I mean, this is a little bit of a kind of moot point, because I think with directors like, you know, not long ago, people like Craig Revel-Horwood from Strictly Come Dancing directed a number of actor-musician shows, and the dancing demand on those shows was obviously much higher than it had been on a number of other shows under different directors. So it's a little bit of a dodgy point, but I think essentially that as an actor musician, you might be required to be slightly less of a sort of major force as a dancer, but you would have to have really strong instrumental skills to sort of balance that out. So really they kind of overlap. There's sort of on the Venn diagram, I suppose there's a sort of overlap of skills, but yeah, the main difference would be that as well as being asked maybe to play that role, sing that role, and move and dance it in some way, you might be also being asked to play a flute line, or learn some simple percussion or kit or something that will also supplement that skills or that the skills that you're offering for the show. But then actually, yeah, when you're performing, that then just becomes another component in the thread of your performance. So you will, if you were let's just keep thinking of that Sunset Boulevard, you know, everyone who was in that was still singing the show like it wasn't an actor musician show, acting it, you know, dancing and fully staged. But just on top of that, they all were additionally delivering the musical component of the show as well, as instrumentalists. Does that help?
Yeah, and I would add another thing, which I was just, as you were talking, I was sort of thinking about, which is the big name musicals are written as musicals. So when you go and see the actor-musician version of Sweeney Todd or Sunset Boulevard, what you're seeing is, in essence, is an adaptation of a
Sure
musical.
thing.
There are shows which are written as actor musician shows, but there aren't any yet which are West End smashes that run for 20 years and get made into feature films. Are we still waiting for that show to be written?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think you're right. I think there have been sort of flirtations with that, but I agree. I think probably, I know it doesn't quite count, but I was thinking of Girl from the North Country, which I worked on recently. That sort of was very much conceived with the music being visible and integrated in some way, but obviously it's a different kind of musical. It's sort of using Bob Dylan's music. It's not quite sort of conceived in the way that we're not talking about West Side Story or Guys and Dolls or Sweeney Todd there. So I think you're right. But there is an interest in that and I think that there have been musicals that have been looking at using being conceived for slightly smaller resources as well, being conceived slightly more as sort of chamber pieces or those kind of things. And I think they have often involved like more visibility of the live music. But yeah, I see. That's a good point. I should do some thinking. You're right. I suppose there isn't a Book of Mormon for actor musicians. That is true. Like the equivalent. That is true, I suppose. I Return to the Forbidden Planet is the only thing I can think of that I know lots of people. I've never worked on it, but I suppose that was like that.
Yeah.
That did have a lot of lives, I think, and was using actor musicians. That's the only thing I can really think of. But no, perhaps you're right.
Well, I think maybe this is your challenge then, Tarek. you have to write.
Okay.
The Les Miserables for actor musicians, and we'll be interviewing you in a year's time.
Actor Miserables, Les Miserables. There's something in that.
It could work.
Yeah.
Work.
Okay. Well, it's work in progress.
Okay. I've got one final question.
Sure.
Which we ask all our guests, which was, if you were to meet the theatre genie, and the theatre genie could grant you one wish, what would your wish be?
Gosh. Okay. So, well, you're gonna regret asking because I get on my soapbox, but I think because you're asking me right now, I can't help but answer it as me right now, which is in this slightly strange hiatus of COVID and everything that the theatre industry is sort of under a little bit of a shadow of uncertainty in terms of how it moves forward the other side of this. And I suppose if I had the theatre genie there, I would be wanting to make sure that the things that I would not be asking to grant the wish that the things that I think are so important about live theatre don't get lost or compromise the other side of this. So there's been a lot of talk recently, rightly, about diversity on stage and backstage and in creative teams, and making sure that we're on a journey of progressively making steps towards making sure that the voices that are involved in our theatre making are more representative and diverse and more representative of society. I think there's a worry that the other side of COVID, that could be climbed back on a bit. Similarly, from a personal perspective, I think live music is such an incredibly important, I would say this, but it's such an incredibly important component of theatre, and cathartic and visceral and, so important to me. And I worry that theatres that might be financially chastened after this period of closure might be tempted to resort more to recorded music or resist the extra expense of live musicians. This is tricky, but put that music I don't know, sort of make it less visible somehow. I feel like as part of the management of the sort of health and safety and dynamics of how we perform the other side of this. And I've had some brilliant jobs where I've worked with performers in the community, and I've been absolutely so chuffed. I did a production of Pericles on the Olivier stage at the National, where they had 200 performers from across London come and perform this show with us, and I met so many fantastic, wonderful community performers as part of that. I'm worried about those things, those connections. I would be heartbroken to think that we couldn't have things like that the other side of COVID, that the idea of getting 200 community performers to come together and make theatre together and sing together and laugh and cry together. That's what I do it for, I think. And so I would be, I don't know if it's too broad a wish, but I would ask the theatre genie to preserve or protect all of the things that matter about the beating heart of theatre that we've been able to enjoy, and to help us continue to enjoy them more and more fully the other side of this lockdown.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tarek. It's been
Not at all. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you to everyone for the fantastic questions as well. Really wonderful questions.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for watching, and also thank you to the Arts Council of England, who made these possible through the emergency response funding. If you've enjoyed watching today, or if you have any comments, we'd love to hear from you on our social media channels. Our hashtag is #WeAreRoustabout. Next week, I will be talking to Dilpesh Patel, who is the head of technical production at the Birmingham Old Rep Theatre, and who also works at Birmingham Ormston Academy. So he straddles professional theatre, community theatre, and educational theatre. And we'll be talking about how you run a theatre technically. And also, we'd like to use these webinars as an opportunity to start a kind of mentoring scheme. So if any of you have any questions that anyone from Roustabout Theatre can help you with about any aspect of theatre, you can contact us via our website, which is www.roustabouttheatre.co.uk. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much, Tarek, and see you next week. Bye.
All the very best. Cheers.